Okay, good evening, everyone. And Hugo, welcome to the ANU. My name is Toni Erskine, and I'm Director of the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge and celebrate the first Australians on whose traditional lands we meet and pay respects to the elders of the Ngunnawal people, past, present, and emerging. Now, this year marks the 70th anniversary of the Geneva Conventions. The conventions and their additional protocols form the core of international humanitarian law and embody our shared commitment to recognizing our common humanity even in the midst of conflict. Now, 70 years on, the Geneva Conventions are more than simply an historical achievement to commemorate. A great deal has been achieved since 1949 in terms of spreading knowledge and understanding of international humanitarian law through education, ensuring its implementation and incorporation into military doctrine, and of course, preventing its violation. And with new challenges always on the horizon, such as AI and lethal autonomous weapons, I think it's safe to say that each is crucially an ongoing endeavor. Now, I want to express my thanks to Leonard Blazeby in the front here, Head of Mission here in Australia, for the opportunity to host Dr. Hugo Slim in Canberra. And the timing has special meaning for us. In the Coral Bell School of Asia-Pacific Affairs, we have another 70th anniversary to celebrate. 2019 also marks the 70th anniversary of our International Relations Department here in the Coral Bell School. Now, important research in the International Relations Department generates evidence for normative guidance and humanitarian capacity building at both local and global levels. Since the department's foundation in 1949, we've approached the challenge of thinking about global and regional affairs with a combination of academic rigor and also ethical awareness. So this is a unique opportunity to bring together senior diplomats from the International Committee of the Red Cross and some of the Bell School's prominent academics to discuss the challenges of humanitarian action in the 21st century. It's with great pleasure that I invite Dr. Hugo Slim to address you all this evening. Now, Dr. Hugo Slim is Head of Policy at the International Committee of the Red Cross in Geneva, and before joining the ICRC in 2015, he was Senior Research Fellow at the Institute of Ethics, Law, and Armed Conflict at Oxford University. Hugo's impressive career has successfully combined academia and practice. Between 1983 and 1994, Hugo worked for Save the Children and the United Nations in Morocco, Sudan, Ethiopia, the occupied Palestinian territories, and Bangladesh. His most recent books are Humanitarian Ethics, A Guide to the Morality of Aid in War and Disaster, and Killing Civilians, Method, Madness, and Morality in War. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Hugo Slim.
Toni, thank you very much for such a warm welcome and such a generous welcome from a Cambridge person to an Oxford person, not always guaranteed. So I appreciate that very much, and thank you. And thank you all for coming this evening, and a big thank you to the Coral Bell School and ANU for inviting the ICRC and hosting us this evening. It's wonderful to be in Australia. Australia is a very important country for the ICRC. It's a very supportive government with a long tradition of taking IHL really seriously and supporting humanitarian action around the world. So it's a great pleasure to be here, and it's a great pleasure to be in Canberra, which is such a beautiful place. I've been driving around, rather surprised that after a short flight it's suddenly autumn again, but seeing the beauty of Canberra and seeing where the government sits here is lovely too. And I'm delighted to celebrate your 70th anniversary as well. I'm so pleased to learn that international relations has been here for 70 years. And it's a great pleasure to be at the heart of international relations in Australia, at the Bell School, and so near the Hedley Bull building, who of course is a legend in Oxford in international relations. This evening, we're all thinking about the practice of humanity amidst the changing nature of armed conflict. And we're doing this in 2019, in the 70th anniversary year of the Geneva Conventions, agreed by states in 1949. And I wanted to bring them and hold them up to you because, you know, we at ICRC, we sleep with these things under our pillow, you know, and so we're totally used to them. But often, some people have never seen them, never held them, never realized how many pages they have of deep law. But this is what we're remembering and celebrating tonight, a great achievement in 1949. Interestingly, in 1949, there were only 60 states in existence. And so only about 60 states engaged in the negotiation and agreement of these conventions. It was, of course, 1949 in a way the high watermark of European, American, and Soviet imperialism. But today, all 193 states have signed and ratified the Geneva Conventions, and they are the most widely accepted and universally applicable treaty in international relations today. This year, we therefore celebrate these 4 conventions as a great moral, legal, and political achievement of our human species. Our violence as a species continues to mark us and poses deep problems of destruction and pain, and it looks set to do so for the foreseeable future. But the Geneva Conventions place deep value on restraint and set important limits to our human violence. They are therefore this threefold achievement: a moral statement, international law, and an achievement of diplomacy. In a sense, they're a high point in the humanitarian multilateralism, which has a long and honorable tradition across all cultures and all civilizations. And we need humanitarian multilateralism urgently today, as geopolitics leans once again towards great power contest and competition, and as new technology sees us on the cusp of a paradigm shift in new weapons and non-human combatants, a new arms race, perhaps. But these Geneva Conventions are ink and paper, and a lot of paper. Together with the additional protocols, it's 288 pages of law. So it's not really the snappy Mosaic tradition of 10 commandments in its text. It's negotiated by lawyers, by politicians, by military people together. So how should this ink and paper be put into practice in a time of changing conflict today? And how can we practice the humanity in these conventions in war today? I'm trying to do 3 things this evening. I'm going to examine what humanity looks like in the Geneva Conventions. And then I want to look at 7 major shifts in conflict today and how they affect the practice of humanity. And then I want to think, finally, about how warriors and politicians can make a virtue of humanity in their day job. So first, I want to look at what humanity looks like in the Geneva Conventions. The 4 conventions of 1949 set out elaborate patterns of restraint and humane treatment for 4 main groups: the wounded and sick in the first convention, the shipwrecked and hors de combat at sea in the second convention, prisoners of war in the third convention, and civilians in the fourth convention. These groups and subgroups within them, like children, women, journalists, medical personnel, religious personnel, are recognized as protected persons. And also protected are certain relationships and certain objects without which it is difficult for a human being to be fully human. Protected relationships are those that are most intimate to us, our family, the people who we love, who give us that vital sense of our humanity as being with others and not just being alone. Protected objects are those which are essential to our means of survival, like water, food, fields, businesses, workplaces, and medicines. And also protected in the Geneva Conventions are objects essential to human meaning, religious objects like Qurans and Eucharistic wine, temples, and cultural property. To be alive is a matter of biology, but to live a life of dignity, one that is truly human, requires relationships, the means of survival, and spiritual resources. And the Geneva Conventions therefore define humanity as physical, emotional, and spiritual. And in this, they are surely right. They say that human life and human dignity are precious and protected. More than this, and in a way that's so important to all of us today who live in a time of climate crisis, the Geneva Conventions of 1949 also recognize that we need our environment in order to be human, and so insist on environmental protection too. Ahead of their time, the Geneva Conventions gave the environment legal personality as worthy of protection in itself, and because we need it as our environment, our human environment, to survive and thrive. It is the mother from which humanity is born and on which we depend to live and breathe. The Geneva Conventions are concerned with persons and objects and their protection, but they are also deeply concerned with actions, human actions, the things that parties to conflict and their warriors should do and not do in war to protect these persons and these objects. And there are therefore clear, absolute rules in the Geneva Conventions that prohibit certain things: sexual violence, pillage, torture, inhuman treatment, and injunctions to do important things like restore family links, protect cultural property, and prevent environmental damage. Reading these texts, it becomes clear, or certainly when I read them, that the Geneva Conventions as texts become a sort of surprising mixture of law book, military manual, social work, and administrative guidance. They are truly a sort of mixed genre. And at the heart of the Geneva Conventions, and elaborated later in the additional protocols in 1977, the 2 additional protocols, are 5 important action guiding principles for warriors and their politicians, which must guide the way they fight, the so-called conduct of hostilities. The first is distinction, the obligation to distinguish at all times between combatants and non-combatants, combatants and the civilian population. The second action guiding principle for the conduct of hostilities is the obligation to take precautions, precautions that protect civilians and civilian objects and the environment as you plan and implement military operations. And proportionality is the third principle, the obligation to attack or defend in proportion to the threat posed against you, and so use reasonable force that does not impose unnecessary suffering and superfluous injury. So you cannot just attack someone that's attacking you from a small building with massive air power which destroys the whole area. The next principle is the provision of relief, the obligation to provide or facilitate the provision of impartial relief to the wounded, sick, civilians, and detainees is another important action guiding principle. And lastly, humane treatment, the obligation to treat all people in your care humanely. So this is what humanity looks like in the Geneva Conventions, these protected persons, objects, relationships, these principles to guide the conduct of humanity, of conduct of hostilities, so that humanity has a place in war and as restraint of war. So this is the humanity of the Geneva Conventions, that all parties to conflict should recognize and respect what is essential to human beings, and then do everything in their power to reduce human suffering and increase the conditions for all people in their power to live a dignified existence, even in war. And that little clause is crucial, because what these conventions say is that this standard of human life and dignity must be preserved even in war. I want to look now at and suggest 7 changes that I see in conflict today and in the landscape that the ICRC works in. And I want to talk a little about what they mean for ICRC's practice and what I think they should mean for state practice as well. What is changing in armed conflict that needs special attention? And the first thing I want to talk about is a political change. Political changes in the world today. Important changes that are demanding a shift in ICRC's diplomatic practice. Multipolar politics now dominates global diplomacy. The decolonization and liberation of the 1950s onwards has seen more than 100 new states take their rightful place in international relations. And some of these states are now major powers, and many are middle powers or small states with full spectrum ministries of foreign affairs, foreign policy perspectives, and engaging actively, bilaterally and multilaterally in diplomacy. All these states are now important for the ICRC to know and to be known by. And our diplomatic expansion in recent years, we now have 80 delegations around the world, and not all of them are in areas of direct operation. There are many, in a sense, diplomatic delegations around the world as well. This expansion is because of the significance of Asian, Pacific, and African states, which can be truly important partners to us in humanitarian diplomacy around specific conflicts where they can bring influence to bear, or particular policy issues where they can also bring their influence to bear. The second issue in political change is, I think, a shift from a period of liberal hegemony, when for 20 years or so, we lived in a largely unipolar world where there was a sort of liberal democratic consensus, and a swing from that liberal consensus towards a new wave of conservatism. This is another political change, and it's creating the rise of so-called illiberal democracies and authoritarian governments. This shift from liberalism to conservatism requires the ICRC to recover a deep understanding of conservative values and to appreciate where conservative and nationalist ethics find common ground with humanitarian values and the Geneva Conventions. And this is normal in ICRC's history. We have to move and engage new forms of power, new patterns of power, and our neutrality enables us to do so and requires that we do so. The ICRC is always in need to develop a meaningful humanitarian dialogue with new political movements of all kinds as they arise and as they engage or contemplate engagement in armed conflict. And in recent years, our sustained dialogue with radically conservative jihadist groups and radical Buddhist groups in South Asia is an example of that needing to lean into new political movements. We now need to be sure that our humanitarian dialogue and our diplomacy is actively engaging and listening to conservative and nationalist political opinion, as it takes a greater place in politics on all continents. This means ensuring that we have a genuine humanitarian contract with conservatism of the same authenticity that we achieved with liberal democracies in the 1990s and the 2000s. Great power changes are also significant in the political shifts today. The shift from cooperation to competition and various forms of unarmed conflict between the world's great powers is increasingly referred to in US policy and others as near-peer competition. This political shift and its long-range risk of global conflict requires the ICRC to have especially close relations with great powers, their political and military establishments, and their humanitarian auxiliaries, Red Cross societies, civil defense and emergency management departments. The second shift I want to observe today is the significant place of coalition warfare in the way armed conflict is conducted today. Coalition warfare, of course, is not new to armed conflict and goes back into time immemorial, but today we're seeing a resurgence of coalition warfare and a particular diverse and complicated form of partnered operations between allied states and multiple armed groups across various conflicts in the Middle East and into North Africa and other places. We need to respond here with a major diplomatic and protection initiative to ensure that we have dialogues within coalitions to make sure that all parties in a coalition are respecting IHL and encouraging and enabling their coalition partners, both state and armed group, to do the same. And this is best done by cross-coalition efforts that prioritize common military policy, joint planning, training, equipping, that ensures that all parts of a coalition are respecting IHL in equal measure. And this, it seems to us, is a really important practice of humanity that is now demanded by the increasing place of coalition warfare. And here we need Australian support, like we need support from all other states, that whenever your military forces are part of a coalition, you bring your influence to bear to enable greater respect and compliance with the Geneva Conventions. The third shift that is very striking to us in the ICRC and has involved something of a revolution in our work in the last 15 years is urban warfare. Urban warfare is the third characteristic of contemporary war that requires new policy and practice to ensure the persistence of humanity and respect for IHL. And the ICRC is especially concerned about two features of urban warfare: the use of explosive weapons with wide impact area in densely populated urban space, and the persistent attacks against healthcare facilities, staff, patients, transport in urban warfare today. These two areas and aspects of urban warfare demand great attention by states and those interested in IHL. The ICRC calls on all parties to conflict to carefully review their policy for using widely explosive weapons in densely populated areas. These explosive weapons may be being used in a very specific targeted way, but their wider impact from blast and fragmentation can be extremely harmful to civilians and extremely damaging to critical infrastructure, water, power supply, electricity lines, on which thousands of people in those urban areas depend for water, electricity, sewage, business, whatever. We also call for an absolute halt to attacks against healthcare, which is a flagrant violation of the first Geneva Convention. We helped to focus UN Security Council attention on this pressing issue in 2016 via UN Security Resolution 2286. And we're now working on the ground with states to try and find practical operational ways for states and armed groups to respect this absolute rule. On these humanitarian challenges, explosive weapons in urban areas and attacks against healthcare, we need Australian humanitarian influence close to the ground whenever possible. The fourth shift that we see at the moment is the one that Toni's already mentioned, which is new weapons. New weapons that are shaped by new levels of digitalization, autonomy, robotics, and artificial intelligence. These are the newest humanitarian challenge today on the conflict landscape. And they are the hardest to predict and anticipate because so much of their technology is unprecedented and speculative. And here, the challenge for the ICRC is largely one of expertise and ethics at the moment. We are really having to get up to speed with expertise on robotics, cyber, digitalization, artificial intelligence. This is an area we're having to move fast on and keep pace with. And the other issues are really around the ethics of these new weapons. What will it mean if artificial intelligence is able to make decisions autonomously? And deep learning machines come to start having tactical, functional discretion on a battlefield. What does this mean for human control of armed conflict? Will weapons remain weapons? Things that are made and fashioned by humans and picked up in our hands directly or indirectly and used like a sword? Or are we looking at the prospect of non-human competence in the future? Not weapons, but non-human competence. These are really pressing issues for us and for the world at large. The application of the law to all new weapons will remain consistent, and any new weapon must still be designed with the ability to comply with IHL, as is made clear in Article 36 of the Additional Protocol 1. And its actual use must comply with IHL. But what does this mean for artificial intelligence? Will humans always be in the loop to retain command and control of new weapons? Will AI technology remain a weapon or become a combatant? These are problematic and speculative ethical issues which we are having to engage with, and we need states and the public to engage with these issues too. So paradigm-shifting machine-human interactions in war tomorrow is a major strategic challenge to the ICRC, to war, and to weapons diplomacy and policy making today. And it's clear to us that the technology of new weapons is moving extremely fast at a time when multilateral weapons diplomacy is moving extremely slowly. And that's not an ideal combination. Alarmingly, but not surprisingly, the hot new arms race is accompanied by a negotiations freeze, as several states want to get first mover advantage, perhaps, before negotiating on these weapons. My fifth shift is about protracted conflicts and the fragility challenge. Not unusually today, wars are lasting for decades, and a lot of people, as they do with so many things, say phrases like, never before have wars lasted so long, or whatever. And all you have to do is read Thucydides, as you've all done, of course, because a lot of you are political scientists and international relations people. That was a long war. All you have to do is go on holiday in Sicily, if you get the chance, and you realize it took King Roger and the Normans 31 years. That's a pretty protracted conflict to conquer Sicily. Long wars are not new. But they pose particular problems today. Violence and conflict ebbs and flows across a country in a long war, but infrastructure and services remain constantly damaged and chronically under-maintained, with health facilities, water supplies, sewage systems, schools, businesses dilapidated in the strict sense of the word, de-stoned, collapsed, under-resourced, and fragile, in the euphemism of global policy. Millions of people live displaced and dispersed across run-down urban areas, or are gathered hurriedly together in large temporary spaces that are a result of sudden humanitarian urbanization in emergency human settlements. These situations last for years and simultaneously give rise to short and long-term human needs. This protraction of need has seen the ICRC's practice of humanity develop a clear combination of urgent relief and much longer-term humanitarian investments. In one place, we need to truck clean water and food. In another place, we need to repair electricity substations, high-voltage power lines, or maintain massive water purification plants for large areas of an urban population. We're repairing schools, upgrading prisons and hospitals, and we're paying for health staff and water authority engineers to go about their business of repair and maintenance for years. This looks to many like development work in war, but in fact, it's the maintenance of vital infrastructure and services for humanitarian purposes, so that people's means of survival are protected in line with the Geneva Conventions. We sometimes call this work development holds because we're struggling to maintain and hold up development-funded systems and avoid major development reversals in societies at war. The World Bank and potentially other international finance institutions are now partnering with us and funding our humanitarian work in fragile and conflict-affected areas where they cannot operate themselves, but where they can use us to reach people who would otherwise be left behind in the jargon of the SDGs. If this humanitarian work by the ICRC and other actors is not given their support. The sixth point is climate crisis and armed conflict. This is something that is being felt by many of the people we work with around the world. And it's the sixth big change we're noticing in conflict today. And it's changing the ICRC practice of humanity. In countries like Mali, Somalia, Afghanistan, Myanmar, and the Philippines, millions of people are living with what we call the double vulnerability of conflict and climate shocks, the compounded challenge of conflict and climate shock at the same time. Families and communities who might be able to cope with the damage, lost assets, and missed opportunities of one or other climate shock or conflict are often pushed beyond coping when conflict and climate hit at once or in rapid succession. The ICRC is trying to keep up with the challenge faced by these communities, and we're finding it's not enough to do what we always do. Replace food, replace assets, restart livelihoods. Because very often in climate crisis areas, the environment no longer supports the livelihoods, the asset holding patterns of communities in these areas. People are being pushed beyond resourcefulness and to the very limits of adaptation. And what we've realized in the ICRC is that our humanitarian practice is going to have to adapt to adaptation. We can't just give people things that restore their former lives. We have to work with them to support their efforts at climate mitigation and climate adaptation, to help set them on a path to an adaptive pathway to cope with climate change. Humanitarian assistance is learning fast in armed conflict from humanitarian and development work in disaster risk reduction. And here the Australian Red Cross and many Asian states are the real experts on disaster risk reduction, mitigation, adaptation. And we as a conflict community are having to learn fast from them about what that means in places like Mali and Somalia and other places. My last shift is in a sense a sort of democratization of the practice of humanity. It is people's participation and the shift in the locus of humanitarian agency. Organized Western humanitarian action has deeply colonial traits, from the period when it followed imperial power around the world to work beyond Europe and North America. In these colonial and post-colonial moments of the 20th century, Western humanitarian agencies leveraged their imperial associations, their technological superiority through their finance, their flags, their insignia, their white Toyotas, and their white faces. In much of this, the Western humanitarian imagination has been dominated by a simple subject-verb syntax of "we help you." But today the tide is finally turning, and people affected by armed conflict want to play the lead role in the practice of humanity themselves. Today, people in organizations in conflict areas and in Western organizations want to change the humanitarian grammar so that people are subjects, not objects, of humanitarian action. And international organizations play a much more prepositional role in the grammar of aid, which might go, "We survive with help from others, with we being the affected population and surviving being the active verb, not helping. The pressure to localize humanitarian action is a good one, and it's championed here by the Australian Red Cross and in many parts of Southeast Asia. Localization, as it's called in policy jargon, is more than direct money transfers to local organizations. It's about a real power shift and honing the skills of North-South partnership and South-South partnership in humanitarian action. Those are my 7 shifts, and I've probably got several wrong, missed out hundreds, and you'll have better ideas. But I want to finally, in my last part, talk about making a virtue of humanity in politicians and military professionals. I want to talk about embedding humanity in the hearts and minds of warriors and politicians. The Geneva Conventions recognize a state's right to win in war. The principle of military necessity runs alongside the principle of humanity throughout the Geneva Conventions and the additional protocols to guarantee that victory has value alongside compassion. But how can individuals maintain this balance in practice? Australia has a good record on rising to the challenge of holding both values in place in its recent military engagements, and much of Australia's success turns on the determined cultivation of operational virtues and ethical culture in its armed forces. The practice of balancing humanity and winning is not a science. The principle-based nature of a great part of the Geneva Conventions means the politician and the commander must operate in the realm of judgment, much more than simple formula and precise calculations of proportionality, precaution, distinction. What is proportionality? What is military necessity? What is superfluous suffering? What is brave and what is reckless in war? Virtue and character are the best generators of judgment to answer these questions. Humanity needs to be imbibed and believed as a virtue in war if the Geneva Conventions are truly and consistently to be turned from ink and paper into actual policy and practice. This battlefield virtue is a painful one, which is always to operate knowledge that they will not completely overlap. Sometimes it will be infuriating for a commander that she or he could not strike a dangerous enemy because too many civilians would have been hurt in the process. Sometimes it's painful to a commander or a soldier that he or she had to strike and many civilians were hurt in the process. In Australia, as in all states, politicians and military personnel are asked to make difficult decisions in war. And it's essential that military culture is shaped in such a way that it develops the virtue of humanity as part of the practice of war fighting. And in this, the Australian military training and reflection is some of the best in the world and has informed and improved the ICRC's own understanding of how to develop the virtue of humanity in military forces. I'm going to end there and hope that I've started our conversation this evening thinking about what humanity is in the Geneva Conventions, 7 particular challenges to the practice of humanity today, and the importance of the virtue of humanity in military practice. Thank you.
On behalf of all of us, Hugo, I want to thank you very much for a wonderful talk on a very important topic. It's really an honor to have you here this evening, and I'm looking forward to further discussion on these themes. Now I'd like to welcome Leonard Blazeby to the podium to speak on the work of the ICRC in Australia. Leonard.
Thank you very much, Toni, and thank you to the ANU Bell School for allowing us to co-host this this evening. I think it's really a a living example of some of the work that, that the ICRC does in Australia, because in Australia we don't have operations, we don't have any conflict, thank goodness, in Australia. So the type of work that we do here is very much the prevention work, the humanitarian diplomacy work that the ICRC relies on to get an understanding of what governments think, of what the academy thinks, of what militaries think around the world, to use it in our own reflections, and also to assist us, most importantly, in our operations around the world. So we're blessed, I think, in Australia to have a rich landscape for both humanitarian diplomacy and for policy dialogue. So the work of the mission here in Australia is to work with government, to work with the military, to work with academia, to engage the media in a number of the issues that are of current interest to the International Committee of the Red Cross, and also, of course, to support and promote international humanitarian law and its implementation. So in Australia, we're thankful of the fact that the Australian government is a committed supporter of the ICRC, both financially, but also in terms of the dialogue that we are able to have from a policy perspective with the Australian government. Issues of common interest are large, and I'll just talk about a couple of them. The first is the prevention and response to issues of sexual violence during armed conflict, and I know that the Australian government supports the ICRC's work both globally but also in the region in terms of preventing and responding to issues of sexual violence in the region in Papua New Guinea, where we do a lot of work up in the highlands in relation to the tribal violence there. In fact, we've just had an exhibition as part of the Head On Photo Festival in Sydney, where we've had a number of photographs of the work that we've done in Papua New Guinea and the tribal violence. In particular, two of the issues that Hugo raised, the effects on healthcare and the effects on education. So that's one of the other things that the ICRC works with the Australian government on, and that is the protection of healthcare, those that provide and those that are seeking healthcare in armed conflict. It's called Healthcare in Danger, and Australia has been a diplomatic partner with Australia in relation to that project that the ICRC has. Another interesting area where the ICRC has worked alongside the Australian military in particular is in a new publication we have on the roots of restraint in war. This is a work that the ICRC has produced in order to look at complementary ways to the law in order to try to have parties to conflict restrain their actions, restrain their behaviour in terms of armed conflict. And part of the survey work that was done in relation to that was with the Australian Defence Force. There is also, once again, a large amount of contribution by the Australian academics to a lot of the work that ICRC does. The ICRC has a law and policy blog, and you often see contributions from Australian authors both to that and also to our journal, the International Review of the Red Cross, where we have a number of contributions from Australian authors. There is also quite a lot of work that we do on the multidisciplinary front with academia for contributions to debates or challenges that the ICRC sees, things like autonomous weapons and cyber and artificial intelligence that Hugo also spoke about. And lastly, of course, we have the implementation of international humanitarian law, and from the mission here, we have people who work specifically on the implementation of international humanitarian law across the Pacific. And in fact, there was a regional meeting held last week in Samoa with states looking at implementation across the Pacific. And a lot of the work that we do here, particularly in the area of international humanitarian law, is done in conjunction with the Australian Red Cross, which has a very strong international humanitarian law section, and we work quite closely with them in a number of the areas in which we work. So I think I'd just like to conclude with the fact that the ICRC in Australia is very thankful for the fact that we have such a rich landscape in which to undertake our humanitarian diplomacy and our policy work, and part of that is working with ANU and the Bell School. So thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much, Leonard, for your words. Good evening, everyone. My name is Bina DeCosta. I am teaching at the Department of International Relations, and I'm going to be the MC for the panel that's going to now take place. So it has been a privilege for us, you all, I'm sure you'll agree, to hear Dr. Hugo Slim. Many of us have read his work. We teach his work in our courses. And also many of us have used Dr. Slim's work in our research. And I can see our students here, so it's wonderful to see nice presence of our postgraduate community here. And rest assured, I'm not going to give a lecture today. We'll have our esteemed panel to speak. You already know Dr. Hugo Slim and Mr. Leonard Blazeby. I'm also going to introduce the other two speakers. We have Professor Ed Aspinall from the Department of Politics and Social Change, and we also have Dr. Cecilia Jacob from the Department of International Relations. So as Toni mentioned before, this unique colloquium is a celebration of humanitarianism, and it brings together ICRC senior diplomats and two of our, the Coral Bell School's key thinkers to discuss the challenges of humanitarian action in the 21st century. So what we'll do is that hear briefly first from Cecilia, then Ed and Leonard, and three of them will ask the first set of questions to Hugo, and after that we'll open it up to the audience. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. It's always a pleasure to kick off the panel session when you thought that you were going to be the third speaker. And there was plenty to digest from Dr. Hugo Slim's brilliant and very eloquent talk, which we really enjoyed. And speaking on behalf of the Department of International Relations, I can say that we are also very privileged to have you here. And we're also very pleased with the long-standing and very warm relationship that we do have with the International Committee of the Red Cross here in Australia. Leonard and his team are a familiar face in our department, and we're very thankful for that. I'll just keep my comments quite brief because I know there'll be a lot of questions in the room. So perhaps coming at this theme of practicing humanity and changing trends in conflict from an international relations perspective, and looking towards IHL, I could say that to start off, the past 70 years has been an incredible and momentous era for international relations in the terms of development of international law, international institutions, the architecture around peace and security, nations coming together to decide to cooperate alongside rules and norms of how we should act and behave. And international humanitarian law, although it precedes 1949, really consolidated and expanded on during this period, has been a benchmark for thinking about how we restrain the behaviour of belligerents in warfare and protecting civilians. And if we think about some of the other bodies of international law that have developed around this time, international human rights law, international refugee law, international criminal law, particularly from the 1990s onwards, a real recognition of the need for accountability following egregious violence in armed conflict, the need for transparency, the need for transitional justice to repair the harms done to populations in the wake of violence. And so these are very positive trends that we have to which I guess this 70th anniversary attests. But we also face many challenges at the international level in terms of law and norms and peace and security architecture. And those 7 trends were highlighted in Hugo's talk, which was very comprehensive in laying those out. So I guess I would point just briefly to the fact that international institutions are a site of development of international law, development of international norms and cooperation. And this is perhaps the point at which consensus is now at a historic low. If we talk about historic quite broadly, we can talk about ups and downs. Perhaps we're going through a down and we're going to go back through an up very shortly. But the question does arise when we're looking at the international architecture that we have is, do we hold on to some of these very political norms and ideas around how we protect populations? Some discussions at the moment, should we just get rid of R2P altogether, for example, responsibility to protect, should we just dismantle it and think up of something a bit better that's less politically contentious and something that states can agree to so that we can get forward movement? And the question there is, if we dismantle what we have, then are we really in a position politically where we can garner the international consensus to come up with anything new? And so I think balancing this need between conservatism and preserving the values of the past to recognizing what are those nuggets, what are those values of humanity that we need to hold on to, that we need to take forward, and not losing those, but to preserve those through a period of great transition and change. And I think the point that you were coming to right at the end of your talk was the need for creativity and the need for strategic thinking about how like-minded actors, organisations like the International Committee of the Red Cross, member states like Australia, and partner states and organisations might think strategically about how we would continue that narrative, how we might continue to promote those values that have held, I guess, a strong level of stability since the end of the Second World War, and how we might do better in actually implementing those, which is a deeply political challenge as much as these norms are contested normatively and legally. Some of the other challenges that we're facing, I guess we've already spoken about the fragmentation of armed conflict, just the complexity of conflicts at the very local level and the need to come up with international solutions to those. I think from the research space, we have had a much greater insight into the understanding of the local dynamics and drivers of conflict. We have a lot of development in research at the international level around global governance and international norms, but how we might better implement these international standards in very localized conflicts is still an area of deep contestation, particularly in an international political environment where there is a real pushback against values of human rights and democracy, and a very strong turn to populism and nationalism, how the international norms and laws might be better implemented at very local sites where that intervention can be seen as highly contested is a major challenge for us. So, and I think perhaps just the final one that I'll point out before handing over is the move, I think, towards pragmatism, how we can also navigate this trend in the international political space between the need to be pragmatic, to find areas of consensus where all states, or as many states and actors as possible, can agree to certain outcomes so that we can get movement forward on resolving conflicts and building peace, protecting populations, without giving up on the values and the norms. Where do we find that level of compromise, that level of consensus that would strengthen rather than weaken the international architecture that we have? And so just to throw open some questions for the discussion, perhaps two questions is first, how would you account for increasing pluralism in the international humanitarian legal space? This is something that the ICRC has very principles and commitments, and there is this increasing demand to account for pluralism and engage with diverse values, different religious beliefs, different political beliefs, and how moving forward. The ICRC is dealing with this challenge. And the second is how the ICRC is also dealing with this global political trend of the move towards pragmatism. So a move away from value-driven international or a global agenda for protecting populations towards a much more pragmatic agenda. Thank you.
Straight away, thank you. So I'm going to offer some reflections that primarily focus on the first of the shifts that Hugo talked about, the political shift. And I come to this event as a specialist in the politics, especially the domestic politics of Southeast Asia, including, well, particularly Indonesia. And first became interested in these issues to do with humanitarianism, internal conflict, peace building and so on, through my engagement with a series of internal conflicts that afflicted Indonesia, causing many tens of thousands of deaths about 20 or 15 years ago, in particular the conflict in Aceh province. Now, Indonesia at that time was one of those classic post-Cold War cases of internal conflict associated with democratic progress. Think the former Yugoslavia, the Soviet Union, and so on. So in many ways, much of the language that we have, I think, about humanitarianism in the contemporary period was really emerged as the flip side of what was in fact the peak of global democracy's advance during the 1990s. That at that time, many of the internal conflicts we were looking at were associated, in fact, with democratic progress. And many of the ideas that we think about, that we use to discuss humanitarian crises and interventions today, responsibility to protect, human security and so on, were also products of that moment of democratic advance. And if we think, of course, at a deeper sense, humanitarianism itself has grown up hand in hand with the global advance of democracy and is linked at some deep level, deep ideological level, and at the level of commitment to individual human dignity with democratic discourse. The Geneva Conventions themselves, of course, were a product of the peak, not of the third wave of democracy, but at the beginning of the second wave of democracy's advance in the post-war era. Yet, as Hugo has already alluded to, we know that over the last 12 to 13 years, global democracy has been in retreat. All the major democracy indices agree on this. They track declines in aggregate democracy scores and declines in the number of democracies. Yet we know also that democracy's retreat in this period is occurring via a rather specific pathway. Again, we've already had both Hugo and Cecilia allude to this, but it's associated not with the old, in general, not with the old pathway towards democratic breakdown where non-elected political actors such as militaries intervene in order to overthrow democracy, but it is being promoted by democratically elected leaders with popular support, in short, by populists, by authoritarian populists who promise strong leadership and, as a flip side to their appeal, focus nationalist opprobrium on particular ethnic or other religious or other minorities who are presented as threats to national cohesion. Now, why do I say all of this? I think because in large part, the particular pathway through which we're witnessing global democratic decline throws up particular challenges to humanitarianism in the contemporary world. Think again of the region I study. Setting aside for a moment Myanmar, the major humanitarian or the major cause of violent death or political conflict, or let's say political deaths in the last several years has in fact been in the war on drugs in the Philippines, which has been a central part of the appeal of an elected authoritarian populist leader, Rodrigo Duterte. Something like 12,000, perhaps more, people have been killed in this war on drugs, many more than have been killed in the more traditional internal conflicts in the Philippines over the same period. Now that's an extreme example, but there are plenty other parallels in the region and further afield that I think we can think of. So the point is, I guess that, and I guess I'm getting towards the question for Hugo here,